for their participation in that rebellion. Most people aren't aware of that history. But they do know that many of our Indian leaders were locked up in what is now Stony Mountain Penitentiary, which was opened specifically for that purpose, in order to accept Indian leaders who were prosecuted and incarcerated for their participation in that rebellion. And that, by doing that, of course, the government was able to say forcibly to Indian people that we have the authority and the right to lock up all of your leaders if we want. We have the ability to do that. And if you resist us, if you try to resist us, then we will do this to you. But following the Saskatchewan Rebellion of 1885, the government decided that they obviously hadn't acted quickly enough. They passed some other amendments in the law that said that Indians were prohibited by law from participating in some very significant spiritual ceremonies. They came to be known as the Sundance and Potlatch laws. And those laws said that if you, as an Indian person, participated in a Sundance ceremony or in a Potlatch ceremony, that you were guilty of an offense. But in addition to that, if you participated in any Indian ceremony, any traditional Indian ceremony involving the exchange of gifts or the use of the pipe or the wearing of Indian garb, then you were also guilty of an offense. I'm never sure what Indian garb is, but you were guilty of an offense. So you were prohibited by law from doing that. And if you did any of that, then you could be prosecuted. I remember, even to this day, there are many of our elders. When I first started learning about Indian culture as a young man, I was always struck at how whenever you'd want to go to a sweat lodge, you'd have to walk for miles through the bush, some cases, in order to find a sweat lodge. And that's because our elders remember the days when they used to be hunted down, and those lodges used to be forcibly demolished for being constructed. And they still do that today. They still have in some cases, their sweat lodges way off in hidden parts of the reserve, or even on islands out in the middle of lakes. But the government, again, wasn't satisfied with simply doing that, because they knew that it wasn't enough to prevent Indians from raising their children, from practicing their culture, and from speaking their language. They knew they would have to do other things as well. So in 1892, they passed another law, interestingly called the Indian Advancement Act. And the Indian Advancement Act said that if Indians were considered by the government to be in an advanced stage of development, in other words, if you weren't uncivilized, then the government would decree that from that point forward, you would have to elect your chief and your leaders in accordance with regulations developed by the Department of Indian Affairs. And those regulations provided that only men could hold office, and only men over the age of 21 were entitled to be chiefs and be counselors. But not only that, only men could vote for those men who ran for office. And of course, what it did was it disenfranchised an entire group in the community, in many cases the most influential group in the community, and that was our women. And it denied to our women the right that they had traditionally and by law, by custom, the right to have a say in who the leaders were. And that law, which said that Indian leaders could only be elected in accordance with those regulations, also provided that if that council wanted to meet and wanted to discuss issues, then that council first of all had to give notice to the local Indian agent. And that Indian agent had the right by law to attend that meeting and to sit as the chairperson for that meeting. And he, in effect, and it was always a he, there were no female Indian agents, he, in effect, controlled the agenda where Indian people were concerned. So by the turn of the century, you can see the government had in place its legislative agenda where Indian people were concerned. And the impact of all of that was that these children were taken away from their families beginning 125 years ago. And they were taken from their families and they were placed into these institutions. And in these institutions, they were taught to believe negative things about their families, about their culture, about their communities. And they were told all sorts of things about the way that they were going to be allowed to live when they were released. And sometimes in those schools, in fact, they weren't allowed to leave unless they agreed to marriages that were arranged by the people in charge of the schools. Many people talk about how they were told that before they could leave the school, they had to agree to marry so-and-so, who was another civilized Indian in the school. Because, you see, the people who ran those schools believed that there was no sense letting a civilized Indian go back to a community and marry another uncivilized Indian. And that, first of all, they had to arrange for these marriages between two civilized people. But the result of all of that, of course, is that those children were raised in an institutional environment. And in that environment, not only did they have to suffer the abuse that went with it, the tremendous physical abuse that went with the punishments that were imposed, and the emotional abuse that went with being told negative things about themselves and their families, psychological abuse that went on because they were separated forcibly from their brothers and sisters, from their relatives. But they were also subject to indoctrination, in effect, brainwashing. And they were told things about themselves which carried them into the future, and which they carried into the future. And many of them, when they returned from those institutional settings, found that they were incapable of coping with community life back where they went. Not only were they at odds with the way that their communities were functioning, but they were unable to do some of the very basic things that people are called upon to do. They were unable to cope with the mere issue of their relationship with other people in the community. They were in conflict with their elders, in conflict with their parents. But in addition to that, because they were raised in an institutional environment, they had lost the nurturing that family life gives to us as children. They had lost the ability to learn from their mothers and their fathers and their grandmothers and their grandfathers about how to care for children and how to care for themselves. They had lost the ability to learn how to function as a couple, as a married couple. They didn't know that. And while the first few generations were able to recover some of that because there were elders back in the communities who retained those beliefs and those teachings, and some of them were able to learn from those elders who continued to teach those things, eventually those elders began to grow smaller in number, and eventually they began to die out. To the extent that after 4 or 5 generations of children going through those schools, my view has been that the impact of those elders, the ability of those elders who had those teachings and who had the ability to allow those children coming back from those schools to recover some of their life, to recover some of their ability to cope as families, to cope as mothers and fathers and as couples, that those elders began to become smaller in influence. And I think that happens to coincide with the 1940s, because that's about the 4th generation of children who went through the schools. And we begin to see the impact of all of that in our communities in the 50s and in the 60s and in the 70s. Today, not only is the Aboriginal community saddled with these high rates of incarceration, but they are saddled with high rates of crime as well. In Canada today, as an Aboriginal person, I am 8 times more likely to be the victim of a violent offense than you as a non-Aboriginal person are. And that's because crime in Aboriginal communities is reaching, in some cases, epidemic proportions. We are in a situation today where many of our communities are on the verge of what I can only call social chaos. We are in a situation today where many of our leaders are unable to cope with the kinds of problems that have been the result, that are the result of these kinds of policies. We are in a situation today where many of our leaders are unable to cope with the kinds of problems that are presented to them as leaders, where they don't know how to bring the community together, where they don't have the elders that they need to get the advice from. We are in a situation today where the vast majority of our people simply do not know their own culture, do not know their traditions, do not know their customs. And they have to look around for solutions to the problems that they have. And sometimes those solutions are very individualized. Sometimes those solutions are solutions that each of us adopts in order to get by from day to day. But the solutions that we as Aboriginal people need have to be collective solutions. We have to find solutions that benefit the entire community. And quite frankly, it is my view that as Aboriginal people, we must learn what our culture has in terms of solutions if we are going to provide any benefit to those generations of young people who are following us. Because for 125 years now, we have been coping with life in an environment in which our cultural standards have been challenged and removed.